All right, welcome everybody. I see we are at 3 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get the rescue thinning meeting rolling here. Before we do, I'll just go ahead and give my usual spiel for those of you who haven't been on Zoom in a while. We're going to ask you to please keep yourself muted through the meeting and keeping your video off. You can do that at the toolbar. Just kind of hover over your screen and it should pop up and you should be able to make sure you're muted and that your video is off. If you do have any questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat box. And as we finish up the presentation, there's not many of us here today, so I certainly invite you at that point to go ahead and unmute yourself, turn your video on, and ask as many questions as you'd like to us. So with that, I'll just kind of set the scene for what I've been seeing in my driving around Peru the last couple days. So I'd like to emphasize that it's really too early in a couple of sites for us to really assess what's staying and what's going at this point. A lot of us did take the recommendation to hold off until we got back into those warm temperatures, and we thought that was going to be on Monday of this week, and Monday ended up being cool and rainy again. So I know some blocks didn't get another round of thinner till Tuesday of this week. So certainly early for us to really see the full picture of how that last spray is going to shake out. So with that in mind, though, the fruits still look to be holding fairly strong in a number of locations and certainly by variety. We can look a little bit more closely at that. From the assessments that I've done the past couple of days, it looks like Honeycrisp and Gala are still fairly heavily set up. I'm still seeing a number of laterals that still look fairly healthy. And again, I'll reiterate that when I check them again on Monday, after we've had more time for that thinner to do more of its work, maybe we'll see a little bit of a different story. But at this point, they still look pretty strong to me. I looked at some Macs and some Cortlands as well. The clusters are starting to thin down a bit more easily, but generally, I think things still look a little on the heavy side. As far as fruit size that we're seeing, it's really all over. And I think a big part of that is from that really extended bloom that we saw. Things that were blooming on that earlier side of that window. I'm seeing kings that are in the low 20s at this point. So today we were measuring 21s, 22s, 23s. Looking across the block as a whole, looking at kings and laterals from the measurements we did earlier this morning, we're seeing average fruit size of about 16 millimeters in Gala across kings and laterals, about 13 millimeters in Honeycrisp today. So next I want to show some of our precision fruit growth model work and our precision thinning studies that we have here in the Champlain Valley. So the first one I wanted to just show is our Gala study that we have. And just to show you the thinning treatments that we've done so far, we had ATS at bloom with the pollen tube growth model. And that was 3 rounds of that on May 12th, 15th, and 17th. Then at petal fall on May 22nd, it got a full dose of Maxell 7. And then recently on Tuesday of this week, another round of Maxell 7 at sort of that late 12 millimeter timing. And so you can see in this graph here, a couple of different things. So we had gone through and counted the clusters originally, and that told us that there were about 1,170 fruit potential on that tree when we started. And you can see our target is at 9% or 100 fruit per tree. And so you can see the results following the petal fall spray. We believe that we got down to about 527 fruit per tree. And then this morning we went out and measured again, and it's now predicting that there's about 468 left. And again, that's only about 3 days since our 12 millimeter application. So I'm going to remeasure these again on Monday. So we're certainly hoping that that number is going to continue to come down. But that gives you a rough idea of where the model is predicting that we're currently at this point on this block of Gala. Next, we'll take a look at one of our Honeycrisp studies. So very similar setup, again, using ATS at bloom, and then followed with a standard NAA and 7 at petal fall and at that 12 millimeter timing. This block you can see really had a large amount of fruit clusters on it. So we started with 1,800 fruit per tree. So the target that we're shooting for is actually about 5% of that total at 85 fruit per tree. Following that petal fall application, the model was predicting about 1,000 fruit on that tree total. And then following our measurements this morning, it's predicting that we're down to about 750. And again, we're hoping when we remeasure on Monday, that number will be coming down even further. Then we have another Honeycrisp study that we're doing. Again, very similar protocol. This time we use precision pruning, and on those trees we actually pruned down to the amount of spurs of 2x. So we wanted 100 fruit per tree. So we pruned down to 200 clusters. So that started us with 1,000 fruit per tree. Following that bloom thinning and petal fall application, it was predicting we had gotten down to 500 fruit per tree. And then following the measurements today, it's predicting we're down to 390. And again, on Monday, we're hoping that number will be even lower. So that just kind of gives you a very rough sense of where we might currently stand. And again, I just emphasize that with these late applications, we don't really have that full picture yet. So hopefully on Monday, I'll be able to get our most recent measurements out to you all so you can see where we're at. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Terrence Robinson to talk about thinning at this timing. And then following his presentation, we'll be able to open it up for more questions and answers.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's am I muted, Mike? Am I okay?
Nope, we can hear you and we can see your presentation fine.
Well, we're here to talk about the very last possibility to spray what we normally call a rescue thinning treatment when fruits are between 16 and 20. Now, from what Mike just reported, some of the fruits are already 20 plus. And so we're at the outer limit of that. But we're really looking at the average size. So if the laterals are still 16, 17, and 18, we still have a chance to influence them. My summary of what's happened this year so far in the Champlain Valley is there's variable bloom across the region. Some blocks of Honeycrisp came back well, others not so well. There was possibly some damage to kings. Pollination period was cool and extended. And especially when the kings opened, it seemed like no bees were flying. So there's a lot of concern about maybe the kings wouldn't get pollinated well. But at the end of all that, when we got a little bit past petal fall, it still looked like the fruit load, the initial fruit load was still very good and on the high side. When we look at the different sprays that have been applied post-bloom, the petal fall spray went on during that period of heat and with significant carbohydrate deficit, and thus we predicted it gave a very good thinning response for a petal fall spray. And I think particularly the last slide that Mike showed, the Honeycrisp block that had been precision pruned that started with 1,000 fruits is now down to 300 plus fruits. All of that is really due to the petal fall thinning spray. So I think that was an essential piece this year. Now, last week when we talked about this 10 to 13 millimeter spray, it had turned cool again. And so if you applied your 10 to 13 millimeter spray last week under cool conditions, I think it would only have given you moderate thinning. And so I recommended that you wait it out until after Monday or Monday, but then as Mike said, you had to wait till Tuesday. That spray went on under warmer conditions, and we're still in that period of time where the chemical is acting in the plant. There was a modest carbohydrate deficit if you waited until this week to spray, and I'm expecting very good thinning from that. Thus, I don't want you to get too rushed here. I hope that many blocks will be done. That will be the last thinner they need, and you can do a small adjustment with hand thinning. But if we still get to Monday, and when Mike does his measurements, it looks like we're still way too many fruits, then we've got to be geared up to go immediately that same day with a rescue spray, because by that time we'll be at the outer limit or the last possible moment to spray. We normally like to get the rescue spray on between 300 and 350 degree days. And you'll see now in this slide, which is a carbohydrate balance for Peru that I ran today, when you look down here at the lower half of the chart, by Monday, we'll be at 342 degree days or 364. So we'll just be at the tail end of when we can get any thinning. I want to look for a moment first at the top chart and just note that bloom in this particular case I put as May 12th. There was a long period of bloom. It was cool, but near the end of that, it got warmer and there was some bee flight, and we got some carbohydrate deficit. So that by the time we got to petal fall, if you sprayed in the early part of that window, which is only 3 or 4 days long, you got a significant carbohydrate deficit. Some people couldn't spray at this timing because bees were still in the orchard and it seemed like petals were still hanging on. And so they waited until the latter part of that window when there was essentially very little or no deficit. And thus you would have got much less response if you were forced to wait because of the bee situation. Now, unfortunately, the whole window for the normal 10 to 13 millimeter had this large peak of carbohydrate surplus, poor thinning conditions, nothing that would really give us the thinning we needed. That's why I suggested you wait until Monday, which are these days just at the outer limit of that window, when we got back to basically zero carbon balance or a little bit of deficit. Unfortunately, by waiting, it doesn't give us really a full picture at this moment as to what the impact of that was. So we're already starting into the thinning window for the 18 millimeter rescue spray today, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. But even though the temperatures are good, maybe even a little bit too good, the carbohydrate deficit is good. It's really risky to spray, even though the conditions are perfect, because we don't really know what that previous spray has done. And I'd hate to see anybody over thin because we just sprayed before we knew what the answer was. It's an unfortunate situation. I apologize that we couldn't get this in a better situation for you, that we could not have this problem of not knowing what the results were when we need to spray. Let's look now at the bottom part of the chart. Today, June 4th, high of 79. Not really bright, but a reasonable deficit for the day. But then we combine that with a bigger deficit tomorrow and a bigger deficit on Sunday, and even a bigger deficit on Monday and Tuesday. Those will all combine to give a 7-day average somewhere around minus 30 grams, which would be perfect if it really turns out that galas are just way too heavy and Honeycrisp are just way too heavy. We can't get the fruit numbers down. That would be just a perfect scenario. Because we're down with relatively large fruit size at this 300-degree days, even though it's warm with a deficit, the model still recommends, because that's the way I wrote it, to apply a full standard rate. There's little risk of over-thinning because fruits are now fairly tolerant to thinners. It's really hard to thin them off, and so you almost can't over-thin. But by the time we get to Monday, fruits will be even bigger and it'll be even a greater challenge. But I still think that's the best strategy, is to wait it out. So my suggestions for what to do if you're still in need of thinning, but let me first emphasize, I hope most of you are done on most varieties, or maybe done completely with the sprays that went on earlier this week. But if when you get to next Monday, you really feel like you need more thinning, then Monday's the day to go. Don't wait until Tuesday. The temperatures will be warm, maybe even a little bit too warm. They'll be in the high 80s, but the deficit's not so extreme. It's not minus 60, it's just minus 30. This will give good thinning, but very little risk of over thinning. You have to remember that when we get above 18 millimeters, and many of the kings are above that now, they're in the 1920s, 20 plus, they're very resistant. So you're not going to take those kings off. And so if you still have a lot of laterals hanging on, spray, but don't worry about over thinning, even though the temperatures will be around 90 degrees. To get any thinning at this time, we have to add a pint of oil to whatever we're spraying. And I'll show on the next page what I think you should spray. Without that oil, we get almost no response from the thinners that we have available. I'll pause to mention that we're working on 2 new thinners, with one with Adama Corporation and one with Valent. Valent's new product is called Exceed, and Adama's new product is called Brevis. that seem to have good action at this timing. And I wish we had them available this year. They would really be a helpful tool in the toolbox. And we can look forward to that possibly in 2023 is when I think both of them will have a New York label. I don't think we'll have it for next year. But without those, remember that what we have available is not that great at this timing. Now, when we spray at this late timing, most of the time the bottom of the tree is going to be over thinned or we'll just have the perfect crop load. So we suggest that you just simply turn off the bottom half of the bank of nozzles. Only spray the upper half of the tree. Now, what are your options? There are really 4 chemical options. All of them have oil mixed with it. Now, just straight 7 with some oil is a fairly potent thinner. And one thing about 7, it will continue to have some thinning action even when fruits are 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 millimeters. So if you need just a little thinning, that might be a really good option. Now, we'll pause here to repeat the warning about oil. Oil and captan cause problems. They sometimes cause marking on the fruit because the captan is taken into the plant by the oil. So when you use oil, you have to not spray captan a week before. Now, we're not a week until Monday. We're only 3 or 4 days until Monday, but hopefully you've remembered that and you haven't put any captan out this week. But even if you did, hopefully you'd have 5 days between captan and this oil coming up on Monday. And then we would ask you not to spray oil or not to spray captan again for another 7 days. Now, if it's warm and sunny and this oil breaks down, probably 5 days between the spray and your next captan spray would be enough. A slightly more potent combination and probably the best that we have available for any variety is Maxell 7 in oil. Now, I contrast that with NAA 7 in oil, which is very inferior at this timing. And it's because fruits rapidly lose sensitivity to NAA after they get to 16 millimeters. Somehow the genes inside the plant don't react to NAA anymore. That's why we can spray summer NAA and not get any thinning. That's why we can spray NAA pre-harvest and not get any thinning. And so it's really almost a waste of money, an effort to spray NAA at this point in time. I put it on the list because it's legal, but I suggest you not use that, even for Honeycrisp. Now, if you're in a program where you don't want to use 7, which is really important at this time because it's the one product that seems to work, is to substitute out the 7 and use Maxell NAA and oil. My suggestion for varieties that will still be potentially problematic. Now, I'm assuming that with Max and Cortland's, you're probably okay with the spray that just went on Monday or Tuesday. But Galas, it seems like you're not. And the data that Mike presented on Honeycrisp is kind of alarming to me. Even the precision prune block that only started out with 1,000 fruits is still 3.5 times the target. But particularly that other block, which started out with extreme numbers of flower clusters, even though a lot of thinning has been done, it's still got 5 times the fruit that it should have. That block will almost 100% guaranteed be biennial because of that. And that's one of the reasons I push this precision pruning so much. That block should have never had that number of flower clusters on it. They should have been pruned off at pink to get it down to no more than 2 times the target number. And if your target's 100, should not have more than 200 clusters. Now, I'm just going to pause right here to throw out one other sort of rule of thumb I've been saying. I can't remember if I've said it here. I know I said it yesterday in an IFTA webinar on Honeycrisp. For most modern Honeycrisp blocks, if you start the season with more than 200 flower clusters, you're in trouble already for next year. So just kind of use that rule of thumb. Almost never more than 200 flower clusters, even if they're more vertical axe type trees. Starting with more than 200 is a problem in terms of biennial bearing. So with that said, let me talk about Gala. I would suggest that you use the high rate of Gala, which is 64 ounces per 100 gallons on a tree row volume basis. If you have tall spindle orchards and they're only basically 100-gallon dilute trees, then you just put 64 ounces in every 100 and spray 100 gallons. However, if they're bigger trees and they measure out at 200 gallons per acre for dilute spray, you got to put in twice that. So it's basically a gallon per 100. So the rates I quote here are on a tree row volume dilute basis per 100. Then you add a pint of carbaryl, and that is not concentrated with this X tree row volume factor. It's simply 1 pint in every 100 gallons in your sprayer. You have a 500-gallon sprayer, you put in 5 pints. And exactly the same with the oil. Now, several different types of oils will work. Dormant oil will work. Also, the more highly refined summer oils will work, or even things like fish oil. But you just put in 1 pint for every 100 gallons of water, no matter how much water you're spraying per acre. So on a 500-gallon sprayer, it's just 5 pints of oil. Now for Honeycrisp, I like a slightly lower rate, the 48-ounce rate on a dilute tree row volume basis with the same carbaryl and oil. Now Fuji, there are not many Fujis there, but if there are, then you have to use a higher rate of Maxell at 64 ounces on a tree row volume basis. Don't worry that if you, well, let me back up. If on Monday you decide you really are 2 or 3 times your target in terms of fruit numbers that are on the tree, don't worry. Put the pint of oil in, put the high rate out, even though it's 90 degrees, because the fruit are big and they hardly will respond at all. And so we need every bit of help we can get. So that's all I want to say on thinning. I do want to repeat and just go over again what I'm suggesting you do for return bloom sprays. Now, I mentioned last week that the traditional recommendation is wait till June 21st and then start 4 sprays of either ethyl or NAA. We're trying to move that up. And so for Honeycrisp, this next spray coming up on Monday would be a good time to start with a low dose of ethyl. And so I would suggest that at that timing, if you're going to spray on Monday or anytime next week, that you spike the spray mixture with a 1/2 pint of ethyl per 100. Now this again is on a dilute tree row volume basis. If your trees are really 100-gallon trees, then it's just 1/2 pint per 100. But if they're really 200-gallon trees, then it's actually a full pint per 100 of your spray water. If they're somewhere in between, a similar adjustment based upon the ratio between the true tree row volume and a 100-gallon basis. Do that next week, and then the following week, and hopefully get 4 sprays on. But we're already now down to June 4th, and if you don't start this until June 7th, you may not get all 4 ethyl sprays on before the end of June. So I didn't really put it here on this list, but I have another sort of caution. If you don't get the 4 sprays of ethyl on before the end of June, you've got to stop with ethyl. I don't want any ethyl on after the end of June, because it can affect maturity of Honeycrisp in early September. I like at least 2 full months between no ethyl and harvest. So if you get down to the 1st of July and you've only had 3 ethyl sprays on, go ahead and switch to NAA at that point for another couple of NAA sprays in early July. This will really help for blocks that were precision pruned, where you didn't start with more than 200 clusters and you have a reasonable fruit load. But if you started with a huge number of flower clusters, you can't even break that biennial bearing pattern, even with this program. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation, and thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to discuss it further with any of you as you try to think about what you might do.
All right, great. Thank you, Terrence. With that, I'd like to open things up. If anybody has questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. You're also welcome at this point to unmute yourself and ask Terrence directly. I think while people are thinking of their questions, Terrence, can you talk a little bit more with the high temperatures we're seeing? the caveats for what temperatures not to apply those ethereal sprays under?
That's true. I should have mentioned that. Thanks, Mike. I think that ethereal is a dangerous product when temperatures are above 85 degrees. And so I've set a lower limit of a higher limit of 80 degrees. I'd like those ethereal sprays to go on when temperatures are 80 or below. Yesterday, one of the growers from Washington was asking me, well, how much more potent is it at 85 or at 90 or at 95? So if you drew a graph, it would go up in an exponential way, that if you go from 80 to 85, it's much more potent. I would probably still be willing to spray at 85, but going from 85 to 90, it just becomes a scary product. And if you go from 90 to 95, then you can drop a lot of fruit. So that's a caveat with this new recommendation that I've given, that you shouldn't spray when the ethereal when temperatures are above 80. Now, if Monday we really get the temperatures, and Mike and I were discussing this before the meeting, it seems like they predict 90s, but it doesn't quite happen. If we really get those temperatures, I would not put it in the same tank as the thinner, but I would hope that maybe you were going to go out later that week with your regular fungicide program and you could put it in that. So basically it works well with cover sprays. Any cover spray you're putting on, throw some ethereal in there, as long as the temperatures are 80 or less.
Okay, great. Thank you, Terrence. I guess another follow-up I have is just looking at our trial that we have. Some of those kings are up into the low 20s. A lot of the laterals that we're seeing, and maybe those will fall off, but a number of those are still 13, 14. So when you say to start those at a given fruit size, should we be starting those when the kings are at that size, or when the average fruit are at that size, or?
So that's a great question. Generally, what we've done is try to time this based on the biggest two fruits in the cluster. So when you see the separation you're seeing, that tells me that those thinners that went on this past week are working on those that are still 13 and 14. If you have 6 millimeter difference between the king and some of the smaller laterals, those laterals aren't going to make it. They're coming off. That's a good sign. It's when we have almost no difference between king and all the laterals that we get really worried. But generally, I look at the king and the biggest lateral, because often there's one lateral that is not too much smaller than the king, and it's kind of the average of those two that I look at when I say time it at 18 millimeters. Now, we may be a little past the point, Mike. Well, the numbers you gave surprised me. I didn't think you'd have any fruits as big as what you measured. So that's a little shocking to me. Probably we should have already sprayed. But I don't want people to spray this past Tuesday and then turn right around and spray again today, because you can't know what's happening. That chemical from Tuesday is still working in the plant.
Sure. Terrence, we were talking about this earlier this morning. With the ATS, could it be that we're just reducing some of the competition so early that we're seeing this increase in king size faster than what we would have predicted from the degree day accumulations?
Yes, that is possible. And that's one of the real values of the ATS. But when there's that big difference, that's when we get good response. Now, unfortunately, the timing for this 10 millimeter, when they were most sensitive, was last week under the cool weather. And I hope it was the right decision. I told everybody to wait, because I didn't think you'd get the response. So that by the time they went on in early this week, those kings were already pretty big. But I'm really still hopeful. I'm expecting that on Monday, you'll just say it looks better. That's really what I think is going to happen. And that not too many people will need rescue sprays.
Sure. Yeah, we're very hopeful for that. We do have some other questions in the chat box. When you recommend turning the bottom nozzles off for this application and just directing everything to the top half of the tree, does that require recalibrating the remaining nozzles, or adjusting the tree row volume so that you're still delivering that same rate per acre?
Yes, and the way I do it is this. Let's just suppose, for ease of discussion, that you're spraying 100 gallons with all the nozzles open. And let's suppose that you do have them nozzle differently, so there's bigger nozzles in the top. So if you shut off the bottom 5, Let's suppose that there's still 70% of the total spray volume going out. So now I'm spraying 70 gallons the acre instead of 100. If my trees are 100-gallon trees, younger, narrow, hedged, tall spindle, then the adjustment factor is the ratio between 100 and 70. So you have to increase my rates, my 64-ounce rate of Maxell up by that ratio. If your trees are 150-gallon trees, now you're basically twice as big as the amount of water you're spraying. So then you double my 64-ounce rate to get to basically a gallon to the acre. So it's just a way that you calculate this concentration factor. Instead of using the base 100, you use the base of the new volume you get when you shut off the bottom nozzles. Now, if people have uniform nozzles and you shut off 5, now you're down to 50 gallons to the acre. But most people don't have their sprayers nozzled that way. They have the 2/3, 1/3 ratio. So shutting off the bottom 5 should only reduce the volume by 1/3, going from 100 gallons down to basically 67 or 70 gallons, basically. I don't know if that helps, but that's what we should be doing.
Okay, great. I guess the follow-up I would ask is, would your preference be to recalibrate the remaining nozzles to get that same water volume out, or
No,
would you just increase that rate?
I just would increase the chemical in the tank. I think the volume of water that's hitting the top is fine. If
Okay,
you're spraying 100 gallons and 70 of it's going towards the top, that's plenty of water.
okay, great. Thank you. So that's all for the questions we have in the chat box right now. Again, I'll give another minute or so for people to write some more into the chat box, or again, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the rest directly.
So let me just comment while they're thinking and while they're writing. This year, it's been the same challenge on many of the meetings I've given around the state, that we are talking about what to do before we know what the result was from the last spray. In particular, I remember Dan in the Hudson Valley, we were talking about rescue sprays, but he then went out a few days later and took his second measurements and saw that lo and behold, the 10-millimeter spray worked like crazy and sent out an immediate response: don't spray anymore. Well, they had wonderful heat at that 10-millimeter and it worked great. It wasn't quite the same in the Champlain. We either had cool temperatures last week when people sprayed, or we had nicer temperatures on Tuesday, but really big fruit. So I'm just hoping that when you take your measurements on Monday, Mike, it'll have good results. But whatever they are, somehow you got to communicate that immediately to all the growers. And I hope everybody will listen and then make their decisions based upon what you see in your measurements Monday.
Yeah, what I think we're going to do is, first thing Monday, we're going to go ahead and remeasure, and then we'll add that into the model, and that afternoon get results out in an email alert.
Okay.
So while we wait, again, Terrence, I did have another question for you. I know for that full bloom date, you were using the 11th, which was our MAC full bloom date. If Honeycrisp were at full bloom, say on the 14th, does that affect those dates all that much, or?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
It moves the degree days to get to 300 a couple days later, so that possibly this window would extend, the 350 sort of cutoff would extend to Tuesday. But we already know from your fruit measurements, the fruits are big.
Right.
The degree day way is just an easy way to time the spray without having to measure the fruits. But when you actually have the actual measurements, that's probably even better.
Okay, great.
Well, just another comment while people are thinking, the carbohydrate model is so easy to use. Each know the bloom date, what we call full bloom date of each of your varieties. Just run it several times and just see if you see much difference in what it suggests, assuming that you're going to need to spray again on Monday. And just look at where it's at, what the temperature is, what the carbohydrate balance is going to be, what the degree days are. I don't think it'll change a tremendous amount, but it would be helpful to run it with the different bloom dates of the different varieties.
Okay, great. Thank you, Terrence. I did also have one more question for you. I know you had mentioned, just the 1 pint in the 100 of 7, because that's all that will be soluble in that solution. Do you think this year, you know, this might have been a situation where adding that extra bit of 7 might have been helpful for us just because of those cool temperatures we did see at that 12 millimeter timing?
Yeah, it would have been helpful with rain. And I'm pretty sure you had rain last week with the cool temperatures, right?
We did, yep.
So that rain would have re-wetted the 7 and would have helped give it an additional amount of thinning.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I don't see any other questions coming in. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and conclude today's meeting. Thank you all for joining us. Terrence, thank you for joining us and giving us your recommendations. We do have this meeting being recorded, so we'll get that out probably sometime tomorrow morning, along with a summary of Terrence's recommendations. So thank you all again for joining us.